Good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you to the webinar on Proposition 16, the opportunity for all Californians. And this is hosted by the League. First of all, I want to not only welcome you, but just go over a few housekeeping details. So the chat function has been disabled for all webinar participants. And so if you have a question, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And the webinar recording and the PowerPoint slide deck will be emailed out to all registered participants. The League is going to be posting or throwing out a few poll questions, so I hope you'll take that. And now I'd like to open this up to one of our keynote speakers. So we are being joined by Assembly Member Evan Lowe, and we will take some Q&A after. So Assembly Member.
Well, hi there. Good to see all of you, and thank you very much for your interest in this as a graduate of De Anza Community College and also then teaching at De Anza Community College. This is family business, and so it's good to be with family. But this is, of course, on the elections and that of a very important proposition. And for context to this, it is such that how do we ensure that we rectify the inequities that exist in our aspects of life, in particular within state government? And this is to repeal that of Proposition 209, which was passed when I was 13 years old. And so newer generations now have an opportunity to engage and help to identify and acknowledge how we can fundamentally restructure our public entities to ensure that we have a reflective society as we see fit. And it's important to also make reference of a key characteristic and note, which is that we cannot have race-neutral policies for very race-specific problems. And how do we ensure that we are inclusive to recognizing that, for example, in our systems of corrections from the state level, when we talk about our prisons, we have an overrepresentation of African Americans and Latinos, and that perhaps we might have a distinction with respect to overrepresentation in our institutions of higher education. But we all know that it's important that we help provide the pathway to prosperity for all of Californians, and that's what this opportunity is. And that was part of that discussion and that of the legislature, which is such that how do we ensure that we continually modify and put policies in place to allow for everyone to thrive. Now, those that might be in opposition think of society as a meritocracy or that we are colorblind, but this utopia does not exist. And that's what we must fundamentally have a discussion about, which is that of race and about sharing power. And these are all very difficult conversations to have. And I say this because the reason why we have this proposition before us in terms of the general electorate is that it needed to be placed on the ballot by the California State Legislature. And in the legislature, there were very difficult conversations to have, which is that of, does affirmative action hurt those, for example, from my community? I have a fourth generation Chinese American, but how do we have honest conversations about the definition of success in the eyes of the state of California? How do we define success? And how do we make sure that we provide our educational institutions and provide that opportunity for people to become productive members of society? So again, this is an opportunity to which we can have conversations and frank ones about race, about how we share power in California, and also based on statistics and data. This is an opportunity for us to meet this moment. I know that we'll have some time for any questions and some dialogue, but let me just finally close by saying this. It was imperative that we engaged in this fashion, and particularly as an active member of the Asian Pacific Islander community and of our Asian Pacific Islander Legislative Caucus. I went to a Black Lives Matter rally to which we heard about a number of speakers talking about the importance of solidarity and unconditional allyship. And yet at that same rally, I had other members of my own community come up to me to ask me to oppose this measure. And it was just such a puzzling conversation to me, to which at one moment, you can be in solidarity on Black Lives Matter, and yet when it comes then to education, maybe perhaps not so much. This is problematic, and again, this is an opportunity for us to have difficult conversations about race, about how we share power, and appropriate ones. And if we can't have that conversation in the legislature, if we can't have that amongst ourselves within educational leaders, then how do we expect members of the public to have frank, honest discussions about this at the dinner table? We all know that we operate and congregate in silos, but it's important that we talk to each other and outside of our circles, and frankly, to have conversations with those that might have differing opinions and different perspectives. So I look forward to the dialogue, but again, this organization is so important to me and to the future of California.
Thank you so much, Assembly Member. We do have some questions coming in from the audience, and I understand you have a little time to answer a few questions.
Sure.
So one of the questions that came in was if you could share a little bit about how the model minority and API overrepresentation is a myth, and how recent immigrants and Pacific Islanders are not doing well.
Sure. The notion of that of a mono-minority. Well, a couple of things for those of you who are wondering about that notion, which is that the terminology. So also my background also is in Asian American studies, so I'm very passionate about this issue. Which is, side note, we're pushing for ethnic studies in the state of California, which is on the governor's desk. But to know our history, and that is that there's a stereotype of this model minority that all Asians are that of a good role model of a good citizen, which is that you are hardworking and you keep to yourself, and that you're obedient and good public taxpayers, and that you have good family values, and that you value education. But of course, when we think about that myth and we look at disaggregated data, which is also very important, which is that the notion and the terminology of Asian American or Asian Pacific Islander American was used to help in terms of coalition building for groups to be heard and to be recognized and to be seen. And so the distinction that if you look at disaggregate the data within higher education, maybe Chinese and Japanese, Korean do better, but in depending system-wide and or specific to that of the respective campuses, Laotian, Cambodian, Vietnamese, Chamorro, Pacific Islander might not do as well in terms of the numbers. So to simply say that Asian Americans are the model minority and do very well is a misnomer and is misleading and is detrimental to that of society, when in fact we know that it's important that we are individuals and that we're human beings, and that we must recognize culture, but that we are also in an American society, and that we must be invested in each other's shared success, which is to say that we must not just look at it from a very protectionist view, that for some reason, if we allow for affirmative action, a community will lose. In other words, one's gain is another's loss. But that's not the conversation that we want to aspire to. And that's not the conversation or the intent of us in the legislature, which, by the way, this received bipartisan support. So when we think about this type of engagement, what is the framework and the conversation that we want to have within the state of California? And how do we make sure that we are having conversations about supporting each other in these coalitions? Because if we pin this to the lowest common denominator and a race to the bottom, this is not a race to the bottom about who the oppression Olympics, which community has been most oppressed, and therefore where policies do we need to be implemented to help rectify the mistakes towards one community. But rather, we all have a role to play in helping us all succeed in the state of California.
Thank you so much, Assembly Member. I know you and Assembly Member Murasuchi were great leaders in the API legislative in helping move that vote forward. I do want to ask you another question. So as you might be a little young for this, but 09 passed, there was a lot of pushback from various communities, but particularly API communities. Today, we see sort of a different demographic. I was very proud to see so many of our API leaders and great organizations that are now supporters of this. So what are your thoughts on what could look different today?
Thank you, Linda. I also want to say that the district I represent is Silicon Valley. And when this first came about, this notion of affirmative action in the legislature, my predecessor was Assemblymember Paul Fong, who also has deep roots to the community college system. But he also was in support of it, but it was politically perilous to him, which is to say that he ran for the San Jose City Council, and one of the major reasons why he lost was because of his support of this, because of the backlash towards the large demographics of Asian Americans in our district that were opposed to affirmative action. And it's important to recognize that, because there's, when we talked about the community not being monolithic, and it's with that respect of Asian American, that Chinese are different from Vietnamese and so on and so forth. Even within the Chinese community, we are not monolithic. That is to say that I'm referenced and referred to as ABC, American-born Chinese. And that is very different from someone who is a recent immigrant from China, and or maybe has roots to Hong Kong, and or perhaps has roots to Taiwan. So those are all distinct notions, and there are very specific distinctions between the different communities, but gets to the point that we talked about. And that's why, again, ethnic studies is so important, that the previous generations knew about how to be integrated in American society, and that we recognize the previous generations recognized the allyship of the moment of the time of the civil rights movement and social justice, of Larry Itlong, and of the farm workers' rights movement, and that of Martin Luther King, and ensuring that we have equal access to the ballot box. So the historical challenges to all this was more recognized, that it wasn't such a far-fetched concept, that of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, of the California Alien Land Law of 1913, which forbid Asian Americans from owning property. It was still part of that conversation, whereas the recent immigrants might have come with resources, and or might come in which we have rectified so much that they just believe that we are colorblind, and that meritocracy, and that everything's perfect. And of course, everything's equal, but that's why they lack that historical context to which we recognize that this is a society in which we are intertwined with each other, and that we're not just about our own selves. And again, I'll suggest that there are those that believe in a very protectionist view, that I want to protect my own children, my own family from having access to education. And of course, when you think about the dynamics and you break it down, some of them can afford to put their child through private tutoring, and might have a stable household. But what about those other households who have come from foster care, or who actually are working to help support their own families and have multi-families in one single home dwelling? So these are all the unique challenges to which we recognize that everything is not equal, and that race does have an impact. Look at the COVID pandemic and the disproportionate impact that COVID has had towards Latino and African American communities. So again, we cannot have race neutral policies for very race specific problems.
Thank you. And I want to encourage the audience who's here, be sure to look at your Q&A at the bottom, and if there are any questions for the Assembly member, please chat them over. So I do want to ask another question, Assembly member. You talked about data disaggregation, and so I'm very proud that in the community college system, our API and our joint caucuses really pushed to have the community college system adopt data disaggregation in our system. So we now have disaggregation of all African Americans, Latinos, as well as our API groups and our Native Americans. But I think one of the things that we look at in data disaggregation has to do so much with education, but yet the disaggregation of data and how affirmative action really helps our communities also touches on what we do in work and contractual services. So what were the things that the legislators were looking at as you had to consider this vote?
Well, we know this, that we look at it from a wide vantage point, from the state lens. Where is the state going, and how do we act as role models to best provide the opportunities and the mechanisms in place to empower everyone throughout the state to help recognize the legislative intent and the spirit of the law? That's why we've seen legislation on requiring women and minorities on corporate boards that are incorporated in the state of California. That's why we're talking about disaggregated data. That's why we're talking about affirmative action. That's why we're talking about public safety and criminal justice reform. That's why we are talking about these issues with respect to diversity and inclusion, and that we must do better. So that goes to the spirit of law of which we're referencing, which is to say that we need to see everyone. In other words, there are many that are falling through the social safety net that exists in the state of California. And this is California. So we pride ourselves in making sure that we are the leader in the country with respect to these issues. And if we do not recognize on paper someone's dignity, their culture, their heritage, how do we then go about looking at the public resources and the public budgeting that goes associated with these issues? That's why the census is so important. Quick plug for the census. If you are not already counted, make sure that you participate in the census so that we get the adequate federal and state dollars that we deserve within the respective communities. But again, representation is very important so that our numbers are counted and that we can make policy changes to best address the societal challenges that arise. But again, we can't do this if we are colorblind and if we subscribe to that of a meritocracy. It just doesn't work.
Thank you. So I have this is a really great question coming from one of our community college professors. So she asks, California passed equity legislation and funding directed to help the same populations as this proposition, but very small and insignificant changes have taken place. So how can we ensure that this legislation does what it is intended to do? And what checks or balances or oversight measures are we prepared to create to improve chances of success?
Yeah, that's a fair point. Look, this is not going to be the silver bullet on solving all of societal problems with respect to race relations by any means. But when you think about the state legislature and what we attempted to accomplish, especially during the notion of Black Lives Matter and what we're seeing, we have said this to ourselves, that we as multi-caucuses, actually, all of the ethnic caucuses from and the constituency caucuses, the LGBT, women's, Latino, Black, Jewish caucus, Asian Pacific Islander, we all got together and said, how do we make sure that we are doing all that we can to rectify the injustices that exist with the institutional discrimination and the challenges that exist on a wide variety of different areas, including education, healthcare, housing, environmental justice, all of these things. These are the things that we attempt to do. So therefore, that's why you saw a number of proposals that were with respect to criminal justice reform, recognizing race with respect to higher education, with respect to the corporate boards and requiring minority and female representation on corporate boards. We're not done. And in fact, unfortunately, during the COVID pandemic, we had to taper down some of our ambitions. So what you've seen this legislative session is only a very small percentage of what we really wanted to do, but we require the engagement of people like you to hold us accountable, to say what we need to be doing and that we need to be doing more because you're on the ground. So yes, you're right. The previous legislation and previous efforts are not enough. And that's why we must continue to do more. But at least though, we can take a look back at the results based on data and facts to say, even in this circumstance, we haven't seen enough in this area. The legislative intent we recognize, but it only has had minimal impact. So what do we need to do to build off of that? That's what I think we need to be realistic about, which is to say that this is incremental. We didn't get here overnight. We're not going to fix it overnight. But how do we make sure that we're headed in that right direction and bringing it all together? Because by the way, it should also go to say that there are those in the legislature that do not believe in any of these things that we are doing. We happen to be the majority of those who are in the legislature that believe this, but there are still many that do not believe this. So it's been my desire and passion to try to build bridges with others to help bring them along this journey so that it is not just pit us against us versus them. And let me just say that you see the conversations in the community out there versus Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter. And you see the hyper polarized notion of our society. And yet that's why I think it's our obligation as public representatives to try to convene and bring people together.
I think that's an excellent point, and it's one that certainly we are all struggling with as trustees, CEOs in our system. So thank you for that perspective. I have another question, and this is one that touches on, I think, the bill that your colleague, Assemblymember Marsucci, also authored. So understanding the history, cultures, and experiences is vitally important. So simultaneously, we want to ensure students can graduate college on time within reasonable unit loads. So how can we incorporate race and historic bias into our curriculum versus requiring an additional class?
How can we incorporate an existing without additional mandates or new requirements? Is that what the
Yeah,
question is?
so that's what I think is, you know, how do we help get this into our curriculum, but yet not put this burden on our students of requiring additional classes, which may prevent them then from attaining their graduation completion.
Well, that's a very complicated question, just given the mechanisms and the governing authorities on the locals, and then also that of what we lack, and something that I've been very passionate about and working with a number of you and Jonathan Lightman previously on too, which is that of a higher education coordinating body. In other words, the community colleges are not talking to the CSUs do not talk to the UCs, to the notion that the segments are really invested in each other's success. In fact, it's quite the contrary. They're all the segments are siloed, and now the CSUs are exploring PhD programs and community colleges are exploring bachelor's programs. And so why are we not having dialogue and conversations at the state level to ensure that there is dialogue about the curriculum that is required, and making sure that there's an adequate pipeline even prior to that of where we get here, and that of K through 12. So the reality is also comes back to funding and ensuring that we have adequate funding. You know, we have not visited the higher education master plan from 1960 in a real meaningful way. And that is where I would ask for your partnership in helping to highlight the importance of this, that we've gone so far from the key elements of the spirit of the higher education master plan. We must make sure that we are the priority, that California on a wide variety is to be the beacon of hope with higher education for those wishing to become faculty members and compensated well for the work that they do, that it is accessible to every single student, irrespective of your ability to pay and your documentation status in the United States. These are all the things that we must fundamentally reform and shift. But again, it comes back to the revenue measures. So again, quick plug, that's why we are supporting additional revenue measures to go specifically to higher education and in education in general, to be able to pay for the services that we receive. My district is Silicon Valley. The most valuable company in the world is Apple, in the adjacent walking distance from De Anza Community College. And yet in our region, you're seeing significant budget cuts, as many of you have seen, but even in the school districts, they just announced school closures. Why is this relevant to what you're talking about? Is because it comes back to the funding. We must rewrite the rules of the economy to ensure that we invest in the public institutions that we talk about, so that we've developed a pipeline, and it's in the best interest of our corporations, because where do you think they get their pipeline of the workforce from? Top 10 universities that they get their workforce happen to be these public institutions. So it's in their best interest. So again, to say that, to close and saying that we must do better. We are not done. These are, of course, with respect to diversity and Proposition 16. But if we're having a frank conversation about social equity, it's all encompassing. They're not siloed. Just because we pass Proposition 16 does not mean that we are done in the work and of the journey towards social justice.
Thank you so much, Assembly Member. I know that we had several more questions in the chat, and we're going to try to answer them, but I want to thank you so much for so generously giving of your time and taking your position to really support something that's so important in our system. Thank you again.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so we're going to move on to our agenda. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Linda Wein, the immediate past president of the California Community Colleges Trustees Board at the League. And I am also a trustee at Pasadena City College. So I'm so glad that you all are here. As you see from our agenda, we're going to have some really wonderful speakers on the campaign for opportunity and promise on Proposition 16, our student senate for the California community colleges, and then our own government relations group. So, and we'll take Q&A after each of these. And so don't forget to type your questions into the Q&A. And don't forget to take the poll if you haven't done that already. So I want to really thank you all for being here. I know you have lots of, we're all getting kind of zoomed out. And I just want to touch on some of the things that Assembly Member Evan Lowe spoke about. And I think that I think that we as trustees are faced with how do we support this? How do we support legislation? As I'm sure many of you who are in other constituent groups, our CEOs, our professors, and our administration. So I just want to say, you know, I personally fought for affirmative action ever since I've been in the workforce, which has been many, many decades ago. And that's because I'm a member of two disproportionately impacted groups. I'm women and APIs. But I believe in equity and fairness for all of our communities. And, you know, as the Assembly member has talked about, many of us, especially in the API community, have faced comments from our communities. So some of the things I've heard are trustees shouldn't be involved in supporting legislation. It's just politics. This is just a way for colleges to institute quotas that will adversely affect qualified students in favor of less qualified students, so us against them. This doesn't really affect the community colleges as we don't really have admissions requirements. So I want to address just some of that very briefly before we get on to our speakers. So I was told by the league I had 10 minutes, but I just want to assure you that I'm not going to take 10 minutes to do this, so we can get on to the really good speakers. But I just want you to consider a few things. And regardless of where you are in your position, I hope that the information you get from this presentation not only helps you be informed about the issues, but also helps dispel some of the misinformation, which I think has been a little divisive about affirmative action. So, you know, we always talk about community colleges and how we take the top 100% of our students who come to our door. And that is true. So how does affirmative action affect us? Well, you know, our students transfer to four-year colleges. They go out into the workforce. They become entrepreneurs and business people, and they apply for contracts. And what I've seen since the passing of Prop 209, which was when we eliminated affirmative action or collecting statistics on this, was there started to be a real divide. We weren't making sort of the gains that we should have been making, that we hoped to make when we had more of an equity lens in our workforce and in our colleges. So, and I've heard many of the same comments that Assemblymember Lowe faced. We had community members who said, you know, if you support this proposition, we're not going to support you in your reelection. And yet we had really strong legislators who stood up and said, you know, we have to stand together in solidarity. We have to do the right thing for equity. And they stood up and took the vote. And I think that that is something that we all need to think about in our own positions. And so I even call upon our community college trustees to, when we speak of support for equity, we have to recognize that our governance role includes standing in support of legislation that directly reinforces and supports policies that directly impact the success of our students in our communities. So supporting legislation is a governance issue. Whether it influences policy or financial resources, it reflects our values as a governing body. And I think that, so I just want to say, because I heard this from our students and from our faculty in a comment that was made back on our own board, we can pass all the resolutions that we want, but if we don't stand for equity, if we don't stand up and talk about our support for these issues, then we're not really walking the walk, we're just talking the talk. So I hope that you have a chance to listen to this, the upcoming presentation with both open minds and open hearts. And let's truly stand in solidarity and unity for the success of everyone. So thank you for listening to that little PSA. And now I want to welcome our upcoming speaker. So we are so privileged to have Michelle Quieres, the president of the Campaign for College Opportunity, who will be our next speaker. Michelle has just been the ultimate champion of diversity and equity throughout our system. So in this presentation, you're just going to be so impressed. She has so much information. She lives and breathes diversity and equity. So with that, please welcome Michelle Quieres.
Thank you, Linda, and thank you all for joining today. It's a real honor to be with the League, an organization that has championed community colleges for so long, and to follow Assemblymember Evan Lowe and Linda, one of my amazing sheroes and trustees for the community college system. It's truly an honor. I'm here today as a representative of the Ballot Measure Committee for the Yes on Prop 16 campaign. Many of you, however, are more familiar with me as the president of the Campaign for College Opportunity. So thank you again for having me. I'm looking forward to answering. I see the Q&A bubbling up here and look forward to the opportunity to share that. You know, this is really personal for me. Some of you know my own personal story and journey. I am the first in my family to go to college, and I used to always say that I thought it was because of sheer luck that I got to go to college, when the reality was, of course, that, you know, it's good public policy, good financial aid, the availability of those policies and institutional practices that support a first-gen student like me who is low income from being able to not only go to college, but actually graduate from college. And I was actually a UCLA graduate student in 1996 on an affirmative action fellowship when the ban on the use of affirmative action passed by the UC Board of Regents and then was voted and approved as a constitutional amendment to the California Constitution in 1996. So I was there, and it certainly seems that we have come full circle from a time in the 90s where we were watching anti-immigrant, anti-bilingual, and anti-diversity initiatives crop up, from Prop 187, which was struck down by the courts, to Prop 227, which banned the use of bilingual education in K-12. The legislature overturned that recently. And now this is our third opportunity to right what I would say was a wrong in the 1990s, to ban the use of affirmative action in public contracting, in hiring, and in university admissions. That's what a yes vote for Prop 16 would allow. It would allow the use of affirmative action in public contracting, in hiring, in university admissions. So I'm here to share a little bit more about why it's so critical and important. I think Linda put it so nicely, so I appreciate that you're having this conversation. If you can switch to the next slide, please. So, you know, one of the notes that Linda raised is the importance of Prop 16 and really providing greater opportunity for women and people of color. And in particular for women, we know that women still today in the 21st century make 80 cents to the dollar compared to their white peers and white male peers. And for women of color, it's drastically lower. We want to use affirmative action as a tool that would really give greater opportunity for women in small business and contracting. There's been really great research that I won't get into during this presentation that's actually highlighted the huge loss of access to public contracting by women-owned businesses, by small business owners of color. And then a real major study out of UC Berkeley that came out recently that actually quantified the very direct economic impact for students who weren't admitted to the University of California because affirmative action was not in place shortly thereafter, 1996. So the next slide, please. You know, one of the tools that affirmative action would help provide is actually in hiring. And I'm going to speak specifically to community colleges, but I thought this slide was really powerful to share with you because we find that actually in K-12, even though The vast majority of our K-12 students, 77% of them are students of color. Only 35% of the teachers that are in front of them are teachers of color. More than half of schools don't have a single Black teacher. And 1 in 6 schools in California, 1 in 6 schools don't have a single Latinx teacher. So I want you to just sit with the reality of the lack of diversity in our education profession. In the next slide, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a report that you probably saw that the Campaign for College Opportunity produced a couple years ago, Left Out. And really Left Out, what it did is it analyzed the diversity by gender and race of our community college, Cal State, UC faculty, academic senate bodies, and leadership. We also looked at the governing bodies. So who sits on the UC Board of Regents, on our Community College Board of Trustees? How do they reflect the student population and the general population of California? And in the next slide, you'll get to see some of those very quick stats. So this shows you the picture of the very diverse undergraduate, community college population that we have. So by colors, just you can see that donut. And then the next slide, you'll see how that appears on our campuses. And this is just for California community colleges. If you look at the report, you can see it for every single campus where we did this analysis. So compared to student enrollment, tenured faculty looks very different. And oftentimes we would hear, well, tenured faculty may be older, so adjunct or non-tenured faculty are more diverse. And our analysis proved that actually non-tenured faculty are not more diverse. In some cases, there's less diversity in non-tenured faculty, and that's pretty disturbing if that is the pipeline for tenured faculty in our community college system. So looking at the next slide, I just want you to see what this looks like in terms of gender. We see that even though 54% of California community college students are women, 54% of tenured faculty are male. Of our system executives, 57% of them are male. And in system governance, 67%, 2/3. So this is looking at the Board of Governors, male versus female. So real disconnect there in terms of reflecting, our population. In the next slide, you'll get to see what this looks like from a student perspective. So this shows you for every 1 Black community college tenured faculty member, there are 131 Black students. When you look at what that experience might be like for a white student in the community college system, it's a 1:55 ratio. The next slide will show you for Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, for every 1 ONP community college tenured faculty, there's 173 Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander students. Again, the ratio for whites is 1:55. And in case you thought that was really bad, this is what it looks like for our Latinx students at our community colleges. In the next slide, for every 1 Latinx community college tenured faculty, there are 364 Latinx students. I hope you look at this and find that this is disturbing and that we should do something about it. Everything that speaks about student success and a sense of belonging on campus speaks to the importance of students being able to see themselves in their campus environment amongst faculty, and also not only see themselves, but experience the importance of engaging with faculty that are of all different races and experiences, right? So in the next slide, I really just wanted to kind of point out a couple of really important sort of markers, right? That the civil rights movement, in fact, has not been so long. This week, Ruby Bridges, pictured here as a young girl who was at the heart of the Brown versus Board of Education case that, struck down segregation or legalized segregation in our K-12 schools just turned 66 this year. That's how recent our journey, as Assemblymember Lowe aptly called it, has been in the fight for equality, in the fight for greater justice, and in the fight for true educational opportunity for all. So I share that because it is a recent journey, and the racial reckoning that we are facing in America today is very clear. We need to do something proactively. So in the final slide that I have here, and then I wanted to, quickly answer one of the very good questions that I saw come up in the Q&A earlier is, again, I think there's a lot of folks that would argue that we should be colorblind, that we should be in that utopia where race doesn't matter. But the reality is that what we're watching across the nation is that race does matter. Race matters in terms of the opportunities you have or don't have in the society. Race matters when an officer pulls you over in terms of the likelihood of you being led safely home or not. Race matters when it comes to, having access to opportunity. And so ignore it. Color blindness, as I say here, is not a strategy. Affirmative action is. Affirmative action is an intentional way to ensure that we can diversify in undergraduate admissions, in graduate school admissions, in hiring for faculty and for teachers in K-12, that we can really begin to build a much more equitable society where everybody does have an opportunity. I'll end with, the very good question, I think one of the questions was regarding equity, and is the argument for equity actually make us think that we should oppose affirmative action? And, the whole notion of equity is that we address the challenges that exist before us in a differentiated way, right? And so equity is not equality. Equality is you give everybody the same. Well, we know that, everyone needs different things and also brings different values to the table. There's also the notion of a meritocracy, right? That affirmative action somehow, will really affect the issue of merit. And I think those that buy into the notion of meritocracy tend to not really acknowledge the values that we place are what we consider merit. And those values are biased. Do we value just a GPA and SAT score for someone? If that were the case, then Harvard would admit only straight A students with a perfect score. But we know that there's a value to other experiences and talents that folks bring to the table, not just whether or not they can perform well on a 3-hour test on a Saturday morning that's multiple choice, and that their parents were able to afford extreme coaching and preparation for, that definitely low-income students have no access to. So again, I think sometimes those messages detract from the real problem and the opportunity to do something. Linda started off by saying that sometimes folks kind of attack whether or not trustees and other leaders should be engaging in politics. Well, I would urge you to please engage when it is about fairness and equity and expanding opportunity for your students. We have a diverse student body in the community college system. We need to do right by our students and tell them that we see their full experience. We are not going to ignore the experience that they bring to the table, and that we are going to value it. So with that, I will pause and turn it back to you, Linda, since I suspect there's more questions.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Yes, we have some questions bubbling up. I think there's one on funding, which I think the GR group may be answering, but there is one, and let me read it, but I'll also add a little bit. So this is a question about the issue that is about the lack of support and mentoring from white faculty and staff, and what can we do to support them more? But I suspect there's a lack of mentoring throughout all of our institutions. And one of the things that we've talked about in our DEI committees is how do we even bring community to to help and support in mentoring, especially since this also touches on professional and career launch boards. So can you address that a little bit?
Oh, that's a really great question. Clearly mentoring and supporting students is really critical, right? And yet we have, incredible counselor to student ratios that are unsustainable in terms of providing that level of guidance and support, and faculty are super stretched as well, right? So there's a need to definitely invest more in our community colleges and to fight for additional funding. I loved that Assemblymember Lowe talked about that and talked about whether or not we're honoring the promise of the master plan. I think most of us would agree that we are not. I think those are all pieces that need to happen simultaneously with passage of Prop 16 to allow colleges to also use affirmative action as a hiring tool when they think about how they will target interventions, right? Specifically to communities or students by affinity group that matter most. So it's not a panacea. I don't think any of us on the campaign would argue that it is, but it's absolutely an important tool to help move us in the right direction.
Great, thank you so much, Michelle. And then, there's a question, since you talked about the Native American population, there's a question on how much do we have more disaggregated data on the Native American populations and the LGBTQ communities? Do you know if that's available?
Yeah, so I know that at CSU San Marcos, Jolie Proudfit is actually preparing to release this fall an analysis of K-12 education and higher education for Native American students in particular. And so we're very much looking to her. There is some data that absolutely, can be disaggregated. We include it at the Campaign for College Opportunity in all our reports. So I don't know if the question was real specific to faculty or to just students and their experience.
It wasn't clear. Yeah, so do you see sort of a difference between the two? I know through data disaggregation, we were able to expand and disaggregate the Native American population up to like 185 tribes, which is still not all of them, not all inclusive, but at least it's the first step of disaggregation. So I was just wondering if you were seeing any of that disaggregated data.
Yeah, so there is disaggregated data, and I would say, that I think one of the powerful values of passage of affirmative action is that it would give community colleges the tools to be very transparent and direct in terms of spending resources to support particular groups based on need, right? I think that we know that there are specific interventions that are necessary for Black students, for example. And if we're looking at data in a disaggregated way, we want to intervene in a disaggregated way, right? Sometimes our interventions are good for all students, and sometimes they're not. Sometimes we'll find that we need different interventions for our Latinx students and that we need different interventions for Native American students. We certainly need to create a sense of belonging for all students on our campus. And so we should be able to do that in a targeted way.
Thank you, Michelle. And we have another question. So community colleges serve the most number of students per color, but yet we receive the least amount of per pupil funding in all of the higher ed segments, and our students receive the smallest financial aid awards. So do you think that Prop 16 could lead to legislative realignment of funding to ensure that community colleges receive their fair share for serving our students in our colleges for equitable outcomes?
Honestly, I don't think Prop 16 is going to lead to that, right? I know you're doing a town hall on Prop 15. I would urge you to vote yes on Prop 15 too. That will result in additional resources for community colleges. And I think we all need to champion greater resources, both in terms of direct funding to our colleges, but also in terms of financial aid. I think we've long talked about the inequities in financial aid, right? That really the full cost of college for students in terms of books, in terms of housing, in terms of transportation, are not calculated, right? We can provide the promise of no fees or tuition free, but that's an incomplete promise if a student can't afford to buy the book for a class, right? Or if a student doesn't have support, to pay their living expenses in the ways that aid does go to students at a UC and a CSU to do that. So we definitely need to do more.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask you the same question I asked Assemblymember Lowe. So with all of these things in place, how do we hold ourselves accountable to actually move the needle? What are your suggestions for our communities and our constituents?
I think being transparent and using data and coming back with very intentional practices, right? Again, there are things we can do now to serve and support our students, and in our hiring processes. I think, affirmative action will allow colleges to be even more intentional, but it's not going to require campuses to use affirmative action either. So I think it's going to be incumbent upon trustees and other leaders on campus, including our college presidents and our faculty leaders, to really charge forward with an intentionality that having a reflective leadership and faculty pool matters, and that being intentional about supporting students matters, and that closing the gaps will happen as a result of, all of the programs and activities that you move forward with.
Thank you. And I know that in the API communities, we're watching the polling very closely, just because we know that there is some resistance in our own communities. But what, as an advocacy group, what does polling look like to you for being able to move this proposition forward? At this time, do you have a snapshot view?
I think, voters are, I think the majority of voters are committed to greater racial equity in our society. And I think we've seen that by the huge turnout and national protest and voter registration and drives that are happening. So I think when voters are informed about what Prop 16 will do, I think we will be able to win this initiative in November. Don't take it for granted, right? We have to do the hard work of educating folks and being clear about this message. I also just like to point out that Asian Americans support affirmative action. So the majority do support affirmative action. There are polls that confirm that. And although there is some strong opposition within the Asian American community, I think it's really important to highlight that, Asian Americans are incredibly underrepresented in terms of faculty and in terms of small business contracts and in terms of hiring. There is a real glass ceiling across all groups. And so this isn't just about undergraduate admissions. The piece I didn't talk at all about is graduate school admissions. I shared my personal experience. I was at UCLA on an affirmative action fellowship. The reality today is that over 53% of K-12 students are Latino, and only 25% of those enrolled in the UC are Latino. In graduate school, it's only 10%. And that's true across the board. The reason we have fewer doctors to treat, fewer Latino doctors, fewer Black doctors to treat folks during this global health pandemic is a direct result of the ban on affirmative action in graduate school. It has been devastating in graduate school.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for this wonderful presentation. I know there's still some questions, and I will get to all of those. We'll answer them offline. Thank you so much. Wonderful presentation, wonderful data. So at this time, I want to introduce one of our students from the Student Senate, Andrew Nichols. Andrew?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. And thank you to the League for including us on this webinar. We're very excited to bring you a message from the Student Senate and why it's so important to support Proposition 16 in November. The Student Senate for California Community Colleges has conducted a town hall looking really critically at racism within our community college system. And it was designed to uplift and address racism, discrimination, and racial microaggressions. And we heard many stories from many students talking about their experiences and challenges inside and outside the classroom. But I'll highlight a few. At one college during class, a student was asked to anglicize his name. And at another college, in the course of a discussion on oppression and discrimination, a student of color brought his own insights and experiences into this discussion, but was rejected and discarded by the professor. These are just a few of the many spoken and heard examples of alienating experiences our students face, but only a small fraction of the many unheard and unspoken experiences that so many more face. The reality is that students want and need faculty, staff, and administrators that look like them. In a system marked, as Michelle mentioned, by an intensely diverse student body, our body of faculty is decidedly not diverse. Students need to have faculty that look like them. They perform better, and they have a greater sense of belonging in their learning environment. It allows them to truly grow and learn, and to not feel disparaged or diminished. The impacts are greater than that, though. We need faculty, and students need faculty that are culturally and racially sensitive and responsive, not just that look like them, but understand their experiences, can guide them through racially charged situations and topics, and that is truly what Proposition 16 will address and accomplishes by repealing the ban on equal opportunity and opening the door for more diverse faculty. It's badly needed within the system, and we should be doing everything on our part to support Prop 16. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andrew. The voice of the students is so important to all of us. So at this time, I'd like to move on to our government relations group, Andrew Martinez and Jonathan Lightman.
Oh, good afternoon, everyone. I know the hour is getting late, so we have a few do's and don'ts we want to share with you. We're going to move very quickly through them, so we'll move to the next slide if that's okay. So there are a few things that you can do as an employee of the community college. There's a few things you can't do. So we're just going to quickly go through some of them. But when in doubt, you should always use your district council to give you guidance if there's any sort of questions about our advice to you. Jonathan, do you want to add on, or should we just move to the next slide?
No, please move. Go ahead. Okay.
So our toolkit on the league's website, which is up there above there, is all the things you would need for Proposition 16 to take a position of support or to advocate on it within the trustees to advocate for it. So let's move to the next slide real quick to show you the toolkit that's available on our page. So if you need if you want resources on Proposition 16, we have on one page on our league's website, again, all of these different devices, materials available. And I'm going to go to the next one. The league has taken a support position on Proposition 16, and we have provided you a model resolution, and we encourage you to take your district to support as well. And I'll just pause here for Jonathan to weigh in as well.
No, keep going.
Okay. We also on our toolkit have some do's and don'ts. So I'm going to go through them very quickly here on the next page. You have absolutely a right to engage and participate as a volunteer for a campaign. You can encourage others to vote as well, as long as you're not, as a public employee, encouraging them to vote for a specific item. So just want to make sure that's clear. You can wear campaign materials, but not during a classroom instruction purpose. And then the next slide is things that you should not do with public resources, which are pretty straightforward, but we're just going to run through them really quickly. Please don't use any resources from your college, and don't work on a campaign during the work hours. And I'll pause there for Jonathan.
Yeah, I think that what's important to remember is that if you do have specific legal questions, you want to ask your district council. But the basic public policy is is that public resources cannot be used for campaigning. So to the extent that you are not using public time or public resources, it is generally permissible. But when we are using public time or public resources, or anything that makes it appear that a local district is taking a position in a campaign, then it's generally impermissible.
So with that, I think, unless there's questions for us, I think there might be one. Let's see. Oh, okay. The question about the slides, will they be made available? I think the answer is we will be posting those shortly here soon. But with that, I think we'll hand it back over to Linda for closing out for the show.
Andy, if I could just say that we do want to encourage everyone to participate in the Yes on 16 campaign. And of course, we'll be doing one on Yes on 15. And as long as you follow the basic guidelines, and again, seek advice when appropriate, then all of our voices will be elevated. Community colleges can be a very powerful political voice within the state, and we have the ability to influence the outcomes of this election. And so we should maximize our voice.
Well, since we're here on the slide, I'll just quickly
go ahead.
note that you should have confidence that the Secretary of State, who joined us last week on our town hall, is doing everything he can to ensure that voter integrity is part of the process. So they, on their website, that link there on that page, you can register with the Secretary of State to see how where your ballot is in the process. As the Secretary of State shared with us last week, you should be thinking about the election as not just a one-day event, but really a 30-day event, and you should be considering how to engage in how to drop off your ballot, and probably thinking about doing it sooner than later. And if you want to, you can see where your ballot is in the process once you dropped it off.
Thank you both, Andy and Jonathan. So on the slides, you also see that, and we'll just go through it really quickly, that there are important dates to remember. Of course, November 3rd is the big one. You can go through this. And then I just also wanted to throw a poll out about your tracking your ballot. I don't know if that got out yet. And then join us for our next webinar from the League on Proposition 15, Schools and Communities First, on September 23rd. So I know we were a little bit over. Please take this last closing poll. We want to know whether or not you knew that you could track your ballot online. This, as Andy said, this speaks to the integrity of the voting and election process. So I want to thank you all for being here. And we hope to see you at the next webinar on September 23rd.